I've lost count of how many gun-related killings there have been in the Western Cape and in Cape Town particularly over the last while. But the figures that we do have is that over 50 people have been murdered in the last 2 months in Western Cape in gang-related shootings. Mitchells Plain, Fulani, Dalp, Bishop Lavis, Tafelsig, Muizenberg, Grossley Park, Mannenberg. Name a suburb, there would be gang-connected shootings. The Western Cape has less than 12% of the country's population, but nearly 90% of all gang-related murders. There's some estimates that there are between 90 and 130 active gangs with more than 100,000 gang members. We spoke last week about gangs in Philippi recruiting quite literally child soldiers, 13 and 14-year-old boys. The president was asked about the possibility of declaring a state of emergency in the Western Cape to help curb this deadly spiking gun and gang-related violence. Ironically, this call had come from the ANC's Dullah Umar region here in the Cape Metro. But the president says our anti-gang plan is enough. There are some victories when it comes to curbing violence. There have been, according to the South African Police Service, since April, more than 700 gangsters have been arrested and something like 1,500 weapons have been confiscated in the Cape. Jeremey Veary, former head of detectives here in the Western Cape. Are you formally part of the Cape Crime Crisis Coalition, Jeremy?
Yes, I am formally part of it, yes.
So your thoughts, I know there was a meeting at the weekend, particularly to formalize a response to the president saying there is no need for some form of state of emergency to be declared, in particularly in the Cape Metro. Your personal thoughts?
Firstly, to my knowledge, the call from C4 is for a state of disaster, and I think that is what we should be more focusing on and what that means and why.
Of course, there's a legal difference between state of disaster and state of emergency, yes.
Yes. The state of emergency call, to my knowledge, has also not been called for by the Dullah Umar region. In actual fact, I think the state of disaster argument started gaining currency in those circles. But let us talk. I agree with the president. The state of emergency is not what, because one of the challenges of a state of emergency, it's a temporary relief measure. It is not sustainable, and it is securocrat driven. In other words, it doesn't follow an approach to stabilization that almost enforces a whole of society or integrated multi-sectoral kind of response as an emergency measure or stabilization measure. And the second impractical thing about it, it can only last for 21 days or up to 3 months. But then in order to effect it, firstly, you need in the National Assembly a 50% plus one a majority. We all know how impractical that is now at this moment in time with the GNU. And if you want to renew it beyond the 3 months, then you need a 60% of that parliament. Now, we all know how furthermore impractical that will be in the run-up to the elections. But let's come to what is realistic here, okay? And that is the under the National Disaster Management Act 57 of 2002. I think, firstly, we must realize that we're dealing with a human-created disaster or occurrence, human-caused occurrence, as contemplated by the Act. And the Act is quite clear when it looks at what that is. It says it causes or threatens to cause death, injury or disease, damage to property, infrastructure, environment. And the most important one is the third one also, in addition to the death, disruption of the life of the community. And then it also says it must be of the magnitude that exceeds the ability of those affected by the disaster to cope with its effects using only their own resources. Now, what does that tell us about? Let's look at violence consistently throughout the years, of course, human caused by gangsterism and the systemic failure of any strategy to deal with it. It certainly had not only threatened to cause that, but it caused those very conditions. And it was of the magnitude that clearly shows us that we need done something more to strengthen resilience within the community and build their resourcefulness to deal with that, in the light of the fact that even the resourcefulness of the state to deal with the problem has failed. Now, what does it say we must do? It says we must have a disaster management plan, an approach. Now, one of the crucial things about that act, it says it must be a continuous and integrated multi-sectorial, multidisciplinary process of both planning and implementations of measure aimed at preventing or reducing the risk, mitigating the severity or consequence of it, our emergency preparedness, a rapid and effective response to disaster, and post-disaster recovery and rehabilitation, which is the fundamental one at the bottom. Now, unless a plan doesn't speak to all those 5 elements, it's a waste of time.
Yeah.
And it does not speak now. So that's the first thing. Now, who can declare this thing? Now, this doesn't depend on the president, man, because the Act makes a provision for local or district or municipal disasters at that particular level that invokes the power of the Premier to make such a declaration. So we don't need to wait on the president here. Okay, the Act gives the latitude for the Premier to do that. Now, if one looks at the Premier here currently, forget about the politics of it. So the Premier clearly has the powers to do it. But one of the significant things, if you look at that integrated multi-sectoral approach to planning and implementation, that if the Premier continuously pontificates that like he or she usually does, that we want more policing powers, we want more that, this is a chance to prove that.
Yeah, so what actual powers would a provincial disaster, what powers would that entail?
No, firstly, like the president has the authority to create a national one. Okay, if it's a national, it goes across a national jurisdictional office. So the Premier is empowered under the very same Act to make such a declaration, declare a state of disaster at the provincial level. So he has the power in the Act, it's clear. Okay, he or she. And all those things that I've read with the planning, they can implement that. Now, I think what we must now think beyond the politics of who is doing what and what divisions we have about addressing and the controversy surrounding it. Here is an Act that empowers the Premier in this province to do something, and in a much more enforceable way, and draw different government departments in a multi-sectorial way, and almost in a command-driven approach that the Act requires to get people to deliver. Now, it doesn't say, it says it continues for as long as the disaster exists. Now, I think we've reached a point, okay, where such a kind of approach is required. Now, if you think about the way natural disasters get dealt with, think of how effectively people deal with a flood. When there's a big flood in KwaZulu-Natal, the Premier declares the disaster and then all resources go into it. But however, what gets lacking often is the long-term prevention one, which is also a requirement. Yeah. So you also are required to think long-term in a sustainable way in order to develop a post-recovery and rehabilitation plan.
Jeremy, we don't have too much time. I just want to ask, because there's plenty of questions around, but we've had a military deployment before. I think it was in 2019. Did that deployment have any impact, or at least a lull in shooting, maybe at least even a reset back to your corners with gangs? Because I have a feeling that is what we need, at least, because we're going weekend in and weekend out of dozens of people being shot and killed. It feels that at least some form of reset is needed.
Well, that is what your Disaster Management Plan offers, your Disaster Management Act offers here, and a more localized control over that process. What didn't work with the gangs still existed under that time. The fact that they temporarily retreated didn't mean they disarmed themselves. They stashed their weapons. They grew their capability. They recruited wider during that period as we picked it up when I was there. And we were all lulled into a false sense of security. The drug sales continued. We were all lulled by a false sense of security that the mere physical presence of people, police or army looking dangerous enough deters gangs. We all know this has failed historically ever since we started having gangs in this country.
Jeremey Veary, former head of detectives, is also a member of the Cape Crime Crisis Coalition. Really appreciate your time.